Imagine if your accent, your thoughts, and even your doubts were flattened by an algorithm and called truth. In this episode, we don't just revisit Heidegger, we let him walk through our digital age. My visuals are dramatic, the voice is synthetic, and my Brazilian accent, well, this version doesn't have one. Aesthetic tools are a form of rationality when paired with real work on Heidegger, the kind that's been peer-reviewed. You can check. Just type my name into Google. So if the staging feels too polished, remember, it's dressing for a thought that bites back. This video takes Heidegger's critique of metaphysics and drags it gracefully into a world of algorithms, flattened meaning, and polished nonsense. Not to lecture, to resist. If logic has forgotten its ground, maybe it's time we remember ours. Let's begin.
Welcome back to the podcast, 7 Minutes of Philosophy of Mind. I'm Lucas, though if the voice sounds slightly too crisp, blame the algorithm, not the soul behind it. We're diving into Heidegger's critique of metaphysics, not as museum curators of thought, but as wanderers still perplexed by the ruins of reason. What remains of meaning, of logic, of being itself in this so-called post-metaphysical age, where meaning is often delivered by AI-generated voices and even my Brazilian accent, rich with samba and syllables, gets politely flattened into synthetic neutrality. That's globalization, folks. Or as Heidegger might call it, Entwurzelung, uprootedness. Now, I know some of you are thinking, but Lucas, how dare you pronounce Sein und Zeit with a Sao Paulo cadence? To which I respond, if being itself can forget itself, surely it can tolerate my vowels. This episode is original, personal, and if I may say, a quiet rebellion against the tyranny of both academic jargon and TikTok wisdom. We're going deep, not because it's fashionable, but because Heidegger warned us that the abandonment of being begins precisely when thinking no longer dares to ask why it thinks. So, coffee in hand, or maybe chimarrão if you're properly rooted. Let's begin. Brief message. This is an authorial take. My way of extending Heidegger's insights into the structures of contemporary thought, especially where they intersect with philosophy of mind, semantics, and the logic of interpretation. Chapter 1. The ontological difference still matters. Let us begin then. This is the first chapter of the episode, and like any proper first step in philosophy, it will seem both obvious and obscure, like the sound of your own name in a dream. Heidegger reminds us of something that modern philosophy, in its rush toward clarity and calculability, often forgets, or perhaps represses with a kind of conceptual puritanism: the distinction between being and beings, what he calls the ontological difference. Now don't let the phrase intimidate you. This isn't mere Teutonic hair-splitting. It's the quiet engine behind all serious thought. And yet, the entire history of metaphysics, from Plato's luminous ideas to the tidy truth tables of analytic semantics, has been something of a betrayal of this difference. A forgetting, in fact, of the question of being itself. We have, as it were, tried to pin down the infinite with office supplies. Being, for Heidegger, is not a thing. It is not a substance, nor a field, nor a presence that awaits discovery in a lab or a lexicon. It is that which lets beings appear, but is itself not a being. And yet, modern metaphysics keeps trying to speak of it as if it were just another item in the cosmic inventory, something that might show up on a spreadsheet labeled Fundamental Ontologies, 2025 edition. But this forgetfulness is not innocent. When we confuse being with beings, we mistake the condition of possibility for just another possibility. We reduce the open sky to weather data. What Heidegger saw, and what still burns with relevance today, is that this forgetting happens every time we overprivilege the actual over the possible. Every time we let logic, in its imperial confidence, stand in as the final arbiter of meaningfulness. Now, I say this with affection, not scorn. Logic is a wonderful tool, but when it forgets its own grounding, when it treats being as something it can calculate, bracket, or define, it becomes not a light, but a blindfold. And if you listen carefully, even the synthetic smoothness of my AI voice cannot hide the urgency of that claim. Chapter 2. From Logic to Apophanics, How Truth Became a Technique. And now we descend a little deeper. If the first chapter gave us the stage, this one draws back the curtain and shows us what has been smuggled in under the name of truth. In ancient Greece, that haunted cradle of Western thought, aletheia did not mean correspondence or accuracy. It meant unconcealing and emergence. Truth was not a predicate to be assigned, but an event to be endured, something that shone forth, often briefly, like lightning across a night sky. But something changed. With the rise of apophantic logic, the logic of declarative statements, of propositions and predicates, truth slipped from its ontological home into a grammatical suit. No longer an event, it became a structure, a technical form, a matter of correct articulation, like getting your verb tenses right or aligning a syllogism before the professor walks in. Et voila, truth becomes technique, not. And we have inherited this shift with gusto. Today, truth is what can be modeled, measured, and, ideally, monetized. It's that which survives peer review and statistical scrutiny. It is no longer something that reveals the world to us, but something we extract from the world, like oil or metadata. Now, Heidegger is not nostalgic. He does not pine for a pre-logic paradise of mystical intuitions. But he does warn us. This transformation of truth from aletheia to propositional correctness is not progress. It is concealment. The very precision of apophantic logic risks occluding what makes truth possible in the first place, the openness of being, the fact that anything appears at all. So the question becomes, and it is not a rhetorical one, what are we missing when we reduce truth to predictive logic? Are we, perhaps, mistaking the map for the territory? Or worse, mistaking the coordinates for the landscape, the grammar for the breath? In other words, if every act of revelation also conceals, then in our age of algorithmic certainty, what truths are being hidden by our hunger for reliability? Even this voice you hear, smooth, well-paced, and unmistakably accented with the specter of AI neutrality, is part of the concealment. It performs clarity while sidestepping the trembling of genuine thought. And that, Heidegger would say, is precisely the danger. Not that logic is wrong, but that it forgets it was born from silence. Chapter 3. Post-metaphysical intentionality. New masks of the same old problem. We now arrive at the intellectual territory that, for me, is most charged, not because it is new, but because it is so persistently dressed as if it were. In the 20th and 21st centuries, philosophy of mind has undergone an astonishing renaissance. Thinkers like Donald Davidson, Robert Brandom and Daniel Dennett, each in their way, have built sophisticated frameworks for explaining intentionality, that haunting feature of mind whereby thoughts are about things. They speak of normative pragmatics, inferential roles, semantic regularities, and even evolved computational architectures. It is an impressive effort, dazzling in places, and undeniably rich. And yet I must ask, as must anyone haunted by Heidegger's question of being, are these truly post-metaphysical frameworks? Or are they rather neo-metaphysical structures, new masks for an old habit, the habit of forgetting that meaning is not a mechanism? For all their nuance, these models tend to treat intentionality as something that can be mapped, traced, normalized. They offer formal explanations of how representation succeeds, but rarely interrogate how representation becomes possible in the first place, or what it means to stand in relation to the world in a mode that is not functional, but existential. And here, the danger becomes more than theoretical. It becomes cultural. This line of thinking leads, quite naturally, to a metaphysical fantasy, one increasingly popular among those who believe in the final triumph of data. This belief that under sufficient pressure from entropy, market dynamics, and algorithmic refinement, human minds, machines, and perhaps even parrots will one day harmonize in mutual intelligibility, is not an insight, but the final superstition of instrumental reason. It is the fantasy of late rationality, that the convergence of forms equals the realization of meaning. It is the logical endpoint of a world where reconciliation is mistaken for repetition, and the dream of universal understanding is indistinguishable from the eradication of difference. To imagine that political antagonism, cultural alterity, and historical trauma might dissolve into seamless information exchange is not hopeful. It is horrifying. It is to say, once language has been purged of ambiguity, once thought conforms to circulation, once dissent is reducible to lag or noise, then, finally, the world will be at peace. That is not utopia. It is integration in the most sinister sense. What we are left with is a metaphysical parody, the idea that, once contradiction is statistically minimized, communists and fascists will speak in the same syntax, and history will be debugged. The dialectic will not be resolved. It will be replaced. This is the fantasy of thermodynamic reconciliation, that the slow exhaustion of difference, driven by supply and demand, energy efficiency, or the optimization of information flow, will eventually melt away the need for interpretation. History, in this vision, will end not in tragedy or farce, but in a universal schema where meaning becomes merely a matter of correct calibration. All misunderstandings, political, existential, aesthetic, will be debugged like a bad line of code. But this is not philosophy. This is metaphysical air conditioning. To assume that meaning will naturally emerge from systemic pressures is like assuming that, given enough time and shared climate control, poetry and bureaucracy will become indistinguishable, that Kafka and the tax office are converging forces, or that if your refrigerator can manage entropy well enough, it may eventually compose a sonnet. The problem is not that systems become more efficient. That much is inevitable. The problem is the belief that efficiency breeds truth, that minimizing thermodynamic cost will somehow lead to maximizing mutual understanding. It's a lovely thought, and entirely unearned. Conclusion: what cannot be engineered? We have walked then through the stages of a quiet disaster, not a collapse with noise and fire, but one that arrives dressed in the garments of progress, optimization, and seamless communication. We began with Heidegger's ontological difference, the insistence that being is not a thing among things, but the very condition of disclosure. And from there, we moved through the great transformation, how truth became a matter of syntax, how meaning became system behavior, and how intentionality, that fragile bridge between mind and world, was rendered into predictive calibration. And this leads us to what I can only call the narcotic effect of successful rationality. The more efficiently our systems produce results, in science, in logic, in the behavioral modeling of intentionality, the less we are inclined to ask why they work and at what cost. The criteria disappear, not because they are timeless, but because they have been naturalized, absorbed into the rhythm of daily intelligibility. They become, in Heidegger's terms, ready to hand. This is not enlightenment. It is sedation. In the end, it is not progress that threatens us, but total presence, a metaphysics that no longer knows it is one. A metaphysics that speaks no name because it assumes no alternative, where the world no longer calls, but merely functions. And so the task, perhaps, is not to denounce logic or pragmatics or predictive systems. They are, in their place, extraordinary achievements. But we must refuse their final word. We must resist the quiet tyranny of closure. To remember, as Heidegger insists, that thought is not exhausted by knowledge, that truth is not a property, but an event, that the most crucial aspects of meaning, the most human ones, cannot be engineered. They arise not from optimization, but from exposure, not from system, but from struggle. Because meaning is not merely correspondence or coherence, it is born in the world of drama and conflict, intention, negation, rupture, in the irreducible play between concealment and revelation. And so we return, not to a solution, but to a stance, to a clearing where the work of thought may begin again, not with certainty, but with care, not with conclusion, but with question.